So, if you're not already concerned about opaque models already, think about some examples of opaque decision-making that in the very least are frustrating, at the very worst might be disrespectful, harmful, unjust, otherwise morally concerning. So you're a job applicant, you send off hundreds of job applications, you don't, sorry, this is too real for all of us, but you don't hear anything back, and you're left kind of wondering, what could I have done differently in order to get this job? Or you go into some office, you're facing a bureaucrat. The bureaucrat, you have a request, say you think that your welfare benefit should be adjusted. The welfare bureaucrat sort of types into the computer, turns to you, says, yeah, computer says no, but doesn't actually explain to you why this decision has been made. So there are a few features of models developed through machine learning that have raised these concerns in ways that people take to be kind of particularly acute. So on the one hand, there's model complexity. So models both use a vast number of features as well as often encode relationships that are nonlinear or non-monotone. And we human creatures do okay with a small number of variables, with linear relationships that we can kind of keep in our head and manipulate, but we don't do so well with these more complex models. There's a kind of epistemic component to this opacity. And then sometimes there's taken to be a kind of metaphysical, or if that's too grand, a kind of wrong kind of correlations component. So you might think the problem with many of these models is that they highlight mere correlations rather than causal relationships, but causal relationships are really neat, what we need to understand, as well as the last talk emphasized, actually intervene on social systems. So without causal relationships, we've got these models that might be predictably useful, but they're going to inevitably be opaque to us. So this opacity is a really interesting topic of scientific concern, but it's also become a topic of moral concern as well. And the reason it's a topic of moral concern is that explanations are often taken to be instrumentally useful, i.e., to be the kind of means to important moral goals or ends that we have. So it's often argued that explanations of particular decisions or patterns of decisions enable values like the following: debugging, perhaps for bias. So it might be that your model encodes relationships that are normatively objectionable bases for decision-making, even though they're predictably useful, but without the ability to scrutinize the model and see these relationships, you're not going to be able to correct the model and fix for them. So recourse, sorry about that. Recourse I will talk about in due course, so I'll set that aside for now. Appeal, you might think models as well as human beings often make mistakes. So without the ability to actually understand why a decision was made, you can't actually appeal it to say that the decision was mistaken. So say, I file my taxes, the IRS says you underpaid. Well, if they don't tell me why they think that, I can't actually challenge them, that decision. Respect, I'll come to, so I'm going to set it aside. Final value, I'll just mention something like voice or political autonomy. So as citizens, we're all, not only subjects, but in a way co-creators of these rules that we live under. And so if you don't understand why decisions are being made, you can't make informed decisions like about whom to vote for, whether to go out on the streets and protest, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so explanations are thought to deliver these moral values for us. So we'll want to ask what kinds of explanations are useful for those purposes. And maybe this is too strong, but I think public opinion as well as a lot of literatures have settled on the following. So the primary sort of explanation is often taken to be rationale explanations. or, quote, the reasons that led to a decision delivered in an accessible and non-technical way. And I take this from the ICO and Turing Institute's Guidance on Explainable AI. There they actually pitch rationale explanations as well as other types of explanations as a way to comply with GDPR. So these rationale explanations are also useful because if they're feasible, they also allow decision makers to comply with their legal obligations as well as their moral ones. So how would we extract these rational explanations? So there are two broad steps, and the first step is really where the model-based counterfactual explanations I mentioned live, as well as other kinds of explanations. So the first step, you might already be fortunate and be using an interpretable model, in which case you just need to manipulate the model, see how some input produces some output. Or you might use a variety of interpretability techniques to, say, construct a simpler local or global model, or to figure out what the kind of minimum change you need to make to some features to change some output in order to extract the most important subset of features for a particular decision or decisions. So we're really asking in this first step, like, what would need to be different in order for this decision to be different? That's where the counterfactual element comes in. And then step two, because we're dealing with human beings, most of whom are not well educated in computer science, we need to translate that technical information into accessible reasons. So note that this procedure, as I've mentioned it, aims to address the complexity point of opacity, but doesn't aim to address the causal point. So that's kind of left on the table. If we think that causality is central to understanding, we're going to need to add in some causal analysis as well. So I find myself a little bit skeptical about the importance of rationale explanations. So I'm going to try to convince you of my skepticism in this talk, and then I hope in the questions as well as in email afterwards, if you want, you'll sort of push back and show me why I'm wrong in my skepticism. So my thesis in the talk is this: for users, decision subjects, and the wider population, the values enabled by explanation are better served by normative and population-level causal explanations with certain institutional protections, rather than these rationale explanations. But, and really this I'll mention at the end, it's not going to be the focus, rationale explanations can be important for experts. So the plan is simple. So my argumentative strategy, remember we had that list of values previously. I'm going to take what I take to be the values that make the most compelling case for the importance of rationale explanations. And I'm going to argue that they're actually better served by these other kinds of explanation, plus broader institutional changes or protections. So first I'll talk about recourse, second respect, and then I'll conclude. All right, so first recourse. So recourse is the ability to change one's behavior in order to sufficiently increase the probability of reversing an unfavorable decision. I've amended a definition by a paper from Kanta Subramanian and Alfano that I highly recommend. So in some cases, recourse might be the ability to change your behavior to reverse the unfavorable decision, full stop. But you've got some cases such as hiring where it's not clear that you sort of have a right in order to change your behavior to definitely get the thing, since this is a kind of competition for scarce goods. So it might just be you need to be able to sufficiently increase the probability to reverse the decision. Why is recourse important? Super interesting question. So there are some norms of fairness that seem to require recourse. So think about equality of opportunity, the idea that, in its most substantive form, we all need to have the kind of resources to pursue the goals that we want. So if you think about that, you might think, well, I not only kind of early in life need to be given sufficient resources to satisfy equality of opportunity, but I also need to know how to change my behavior in order to better satisfy some systems of rules in order to get the goal that I want. So it would be deeply unfair if, say material resources were evenly distributed, and yet some people, the children of the elite, knew what they needed to do in order to occupy the highest positions in society, and then everybody else didn't know. And so while they had all these material resources, they weren't able to pursue these goals. Venkat Subramanian and Alfano identify a kind of different but related grounding, that and the importance of being able to engage in temporally extended agency. So I, as a person living in society, need to be able to make plans that I can carry through over time. If I can't reliably reverse decisions that go against my plans, I won't be able to carry them out. All right, so a motivating case for the kind of importance of recourse as well as the importance of rationale explanations to satisfy it. So Abid, a registered nurse in Massachusetts, moves to California and applies for a job at his local hospital. He's told that he has to be licensed in California, which involves paperwork to verify his Massachusetts license and a background check. So it seems important that Abid is told what he needs to do in order to satisfy the rules. He can do so and become a nurse in California. So in this case, these kind of rational explanations, or in algorithmic cases, model-based counterfactual explanations, are the remedy. He's told what would he need to do, what steps would he need to take in order to change the decision outcome. All right, so two more cases to kind of complicate this simple notion of recourse. So first case, Abid, a registered nurse in Massachusetts, moves to California and applies for a job at his local hospital. He's told that the hospital needs nurse anesthetists, and if he got additional licensing, he would get the job. Second case, Abid, a registered nurse in Massachusetts, moves to California and applies for a job at his local hospital. He's told that if he smiles 30% more in his video interview, he would get the job. All right, these cases, I take it, don't strike us as compelling. Why not? So you might think we had an incomplete notion of recourse and what it requires. So it actually requires the ability to change one's behavior in sufficiently low-cost ways in order to sufficiently increase the probability of reversing an unfavorable decision for the right reasons. And this is pointed out in the Venkat Subramanian and Alfano paper that I've been citing. So far you might think like, so good, no big problems. We just need to give modified rationale explanations. So you might think individuals should be provided with the reasons that led to the decision, which are sufficiently low cost for her to act on, and which are normatively relevant. So I think these modified rationale explanations are not actually the best kind of explanation to target this more sophisticated notion of recourse. And I also think, and this connects with Annette's paper, that in fact, focusing too much on rationale explanations actually might lead us to kind of misformulate the problem and ignore wider injustices that we might want to solve differently. So the first thing to notice is that how we spell out low cost has to be population level. It would be, enormously invasive and impractical, as well as kind of paternalistic potentially, to gather a bunch of information about you specifically and figure out which reasons would be low cost for you to act on. Instead, we're going to need reasons that are kind of low cost for people generally to act on. And other people have noticed this. What I'm using for this point is kind of relevant for my purposes because it moves us away, I think, from thinking about rationale explanations as the right thing here to a kind of population level causal explanation. So what are the kind of causal factors that people like me generally need to act on to change, to lead to some kind of result? So second, and I think maybe most important, this notion of giving normatively relevant reasons is, I think, going to be too stringent a requirement in lots of cases. So there's one way of reading this requirement where, you know, you just kind of keep your model as is, and then you just select some of the reasons that are, or sorry, the kind of counterfactuals that would be both low cost and which we judge to be the right kind of reasons or normatively relevant. So, you know, say you've got a credit model that uses both social media data and income. We might think social media data is like the wrong kind of data to be basing this decision on, whatever that means, but go with me. Instead, we want to base it on factors like income. So we'll give individuals that information. I think that in a way I'm sort of okay with that understanding of how to set up the solution. But again, I think that's going to look less like a rationale explanation and more like something, what I'll come to, a kind of rule-based explanation, just a description of the kind of rules by which we ought to be making the decisions that we already know. Contrast that with another kind of way of reading this requirement, where instead we need the model to only contain normatively relevant reasons. I think this is too stringent a requirement because, first of all, we often use models developed through machine learning in precisely cases where we don't actually know what the best normatively relevant reasons are. And we think this model might do better at promoting values like efficiency or fairness. And so by using these, by sort of like restricting our use of these models across all cases, we might prejudge those values too strongly. And second, we often use models in non-algorithmic cases, or we do decision-making that relies on proxies in non-algorithmic cases. Sometimes these proxies are not always normatively relevant in this way. So it would be a very strong conclusion to think they always had to be. And finally, I think rationale explanations are really doing too much work here. So I think what, for example, this recognition of low cost latched onto was a kind of insight from political philosophy about the unfairness that can come in from setting up a kind of system of positions and rules that naturally privileges people with some talents and not others. So, you know, say the way that we set up promotions for doctors and hospitals relies on their, you know, scores on certain intelligence tests and surgical or other treatment outcomes which are quantifiable. This is going to privilege people with certain kinds of talents and skills, but, you know, sort of like deprivilege, if you will, other people, say, whose skills involve communication or other kinds of skills that are also very relevant for doctors that we could have chosen. And so what our kind of objection here was highlighting are, I think, potential background injustices or kind of costs of setting up systems in a certain way that are not actually best addressed by rationale explanations, but are best addressed by maybe shifting or broadening our decision landscape to connect to a net stock or through other means. All right, so the upshot here, I think, is that population-level causal explanations are really the things that we want in order to give population-level actionable information. And at the same time, we want normative explanations to explain what the rules are and why they're good. So when people, I think there's been a kind of a too narrow focus in this literature on recourse in giving people very narrow counterfactual information that they can act on, because we're assuming that people's goals are really fixed, that the rules are kind of static, and that it'll be clear that, you know, to them that they'll want to act on this information. And instead, I think the agent's kind of deliberative problem is a bit more complicated, they need information to help them think through, is this actually a change that I want to make? And that will include whether it's low cost or feasible, the kind of information population level explanations can give. But they'll also want to think through, like, is this a kind of institution or organization that I want to continue to buy into, things like that. And finally, we need institutional changes to make sure recourse doesn't bear too much normative weight. All right, so value number 2, respect. We'll go through this a little bit more quickly. All right, so a motivating case to kind of get you into the idea that algorithmic systems can cause disrespect. So again, maybe a little bit too real. So Abby applies for a number of jobs, but does not hear back from any of them for months, leaving her to assume she's been rejected. Or imagine the case I gave you earlier. You go into your local bureaucratic office, you apply for something, say a new driving license, welfare benefits, a visa, and the decision maker just gives you this decision, says no, and just doesn't explain to you why she's made the decision she's made. So I find it actually, some people are very struck by the thought that not having explanations can be disrespectful. And you might just think, like, having a decision made about you and not having it explained to you, in particular not getting the decision maker's motivating reasons for the decision, is kind of in and of itself disrespectful. It's always disrespectful, and so this is something that we need rationale explanations for. I think this would be a little too quick. So even in interpersonal cases, we recognize that people have kind of spheres of personal discretion where their decisions need to be, from a moral point of view, justifiable to us. They need to be morally right by us, but people have actually some discretion not to actually explain the decision to us. And so too, you might think for institutional decision makers, maybe just for reasons of efficiency, actually we all might not want all of these decisions to be explained because that's going to take a lot of time, involve a lot more bureaucracy and documenting. So as a society, we might think, well, we have reason to give these institutional decision makers some discretion. Maybe in the private sphere, there's something about being in the private sphere that allows that as well. All right, so I think what this shows us is that we really need to hone in on what notion of respect we're thinking about when we think not explaining these decisions is disrespectful. So here I follow broadly a distinction from Stephen Darwall. And the upshot is I only think one of these notions of respect is going to involve explainability. So the first kind of respect, called appraisal respect, appropriately appreciating someone's excellences, we might, in particular, Darwall is concerned with moral excellences, so we might, as an example, say, I really respect the decision you made. It was tough, and I think you made a good decision. That's not the kind of respect we're concerned with here. Instead, I think we're probably concerned with what Darwall calls recognition respect, or giving appropriate weight to some fact and deliberating about how to act. So there are two ways that you might cash this out. So the first way has to do with taking someone's interest or point of view into account. Darwall calls this a kind of epistemic stance towards someone. So he uses the case where you're stepping on someone's foot. And to take a kind of epistemic stance towards their interests or points of view might be, you've got this moral rule in your mind that, like, I ought not to cause people pain. And then the person says to you, hey, you're causing me pain. And this is just kind of like mere information that you upload and combine with this rule in order to say, I ought to stop doing this. So again, I think you can take someone's interest or point of view into account without actually explaining the decision to them, as long as their interest is not explanation, but that might be a bit too easy. So I think it's really this second notion of respect that's going to get us somewhere. Is treating with someone with dignity, as responsible, or with the authority to generate claims. So it's taking what Darwall calls a second personal stance towards them, and Strawson calls a participant stance. So really treating them as a person that you interact with morally, that's making claims on you, where you have to answer those claims appropriately. And as well, where certain kinds of attitudes are appropriate, like they might blame you if you don't do something, you might feel guilty, etc. So I think this is the kind of most promising notion here. I think it's not clear that we want decision makers in institutions to take this stance, but in any case, it's one that only I think certain kinds of creatures like human beings can take. So we need AI to provide rational explanations to them so people can treat decision makers respectfully. So I'm running out of time, so I'll go through this a little bit quickly, but feel free to ask me about it. So it seems as if this notion of recognition respect requires that first, I'm able to address my demands to some decision maker. We're in a certain kind of communicative relationship where they're not just explaining down to me, I'm kind of demanding up to them. And this is particularly important in institutional context where there's some kind of power differential where we need to be able to demand up. And secondly, it's important that decision makers can justify their actions in terms of my demands. However, justifying their actions, and I can talk about this more in Q&A, might involve giving sometimes the kind of rationale for the action, but it might actually look more like a kind of reason why the action is appropriate that is separate from the actual why did it occur. Again, I can talk more about that. Okay. To quickly conclude, so the reason that I think rationale explanations are appealing is first because they seem to best enable accountability. That was the kind of discussion of recourse. So it seems that, as with human beings, if we could have insight into people's motivation, then we might be able to hold them accountable for things like making mistakes, being discriminatory, maybe, changing our behavior in order to fit rules. And second, I think they're appealing because they seem to approximate an important human practice, justifying oneself. But I think we kind of end up in a problem of the second best, where we want something from machines that in fact they're not best able to kind of give us, and so we should move to other kind of explanations. I'm also kind of worried that these rationale explanations might be a smokescreen for unjust purposes. They might allow us a lot of procedural clarity, but they might kind of stop us from really examining the ends that these systems are meant to serve. So an alternative, causal and normative explanations, as well as focus on broader questions of institutional design. I think I should stop there on this evocative slide, and thank you all for listening and look forward to your questions. Sorry, I went a little bit over.